We heard from Fed Chair Jay Powell at the NABE meetings down in Washington, and he went out of his way to sort of correct the record on exactly how aggressive the Fed will be. Some people have said he was responding to some of your criticisms of what he said last week, where clearly the bond markets didn't listen to him.
You know, I don't know whether I had anything to do with it at all. I think he did signal more hawkishness, and I think that was very much warranted given the inflation threat. I do think there are a number of problems in Fed thought where they're advocating and making arguments that I don't think really stand up to economic scrutiny.
So let's go through some of those arguments. One of the things I think I heard from the chair was actually inflation is going to get relieved because there will be an expansion in the labor force. It'll relieve some of the wage pressure that you've talked about.
You know, an expansion in the labor force matters if it changes the supply-demand balance in an important way. But if the people all work, then it translates into more demand, offsetting the increase in supply. And the Fed's not forecasting any increase in unemployment. So with no forecasted increase in unemployment, I don't know why one would think that an expanded labor force would somehow be a reason why inflation would come down. It would only exert restraint on wages if it translated into higher unemployment, something the Fed is at pains to predict will not take place.
So the second thing that we heard from the chair today, this week, was, in fact, that they are willing to go up to the neutral rate and above the neutral rate in the Fed funds in order to get inflation under control. Is that going to do it?
I think we have to be careful with that. In a sense, I think the Fed is doing a summa can opener economics. After the old joke about the economist, when asked how to get into a tuna fish can, says, assume we have a can opener. The reality is that the neutral interest rate is a real interest rate concept. It reflects the difference between the interest rate and inflation. What the Fed's doing is assuming their own success with respect to inflation, that it comes down to about 2%, and then saying that their interest rate forecast will represent a positive real interest rate and will correspond to their neutral interest rate. But it all depends on assuming their success. Markets are saying that real interest rates aren't getting anywhere near the Fed's estimate of the neutral real interest rate anytime in the next 5 years. And certainly that's what most professional forecasters are saying in terms of their views about inflation. So I don't think we're seeing the kind of increase in interest rates that's usually necessary to go for inflation. I don't agree with Republican economist John Taylor on that many things, but his Taylor principle that to stop inflation, you have to raise interest rates by more than inflation goes up, because otherwise the real interest rate is coming down, that's a valid principle, but not one that's yet been internalized in the Fed's forecasts.
Third thing that we heard from the chair this week was he admitted, I think, that it's going to be difficult to have a soft landing. He nonetheless is confident it can be done, in part because it's been done before. There are at least 3 other instances people are pointing to, right? 94, 84, 69.
I don't see how anybody can regard those as very relevant precedents. In none of them was the CPI at anything like 8% when the episode started. In none of them was the unemployment rate or the vacancy to unemployment rate in historically tight labor market territory. And in all of them, the whole point by the Fed was preemptive action to restrain. And that's what this Fed ruled out in its 2020 operating framework. So look, many things are possible, and I share very much the chairman's hope that a soft landing is possible, but I don't think it's something we can count on.
So, Larry, are you confident that we know what it will take to get inflation down at this point? Or more important, does the Fed know?
Look, nobody knows. I certainly don't. I don't think the Fed knows. I do think that it's likely to require significantly greater interest rate hikes than the Fed or markets are now expecting. And I do think that we need clear signals that we're prepared to accept some slowdown in economic activity if that's the price of reducing inflation. Otherwise, we're going to be making the mistakes of the 1970s that will ultimately create a need for a really catastrophic recession. I think that can be avoided, but it can't be avoided if we're counting on some kind of immaculate reversion of inflation or immaculate disinflation.
Larry, as we speak, that horrific war in Ukraine continues, and of course we're all fixated on the death and destruction, but there are also economic consequences. What do you see as potential longer-range global economic consequences of what we're seeing?
I fear, and it's too early to know, and we'll never get the data to do a really accurate measurement, but my fear is that there's going to be more death thousands of miles from Ukraine because of the food price hikes, food shortages, and potential famines that are associated with the loss of crop in Ukraine and Russia, that will ultimately be the cause of more death than what happens in Ukraine. That, of course, is not to minimize the tragedy in Ukraine, but it is to point up the need for the world community to be focusing, even on as it focuses on Ukraine, to be focusing on the needs of developing countries broadly, the need for financing, the need for debt relief, the need for food allocations. I think this is a critical issue, and it could become a more critical issue depending on developments in the next few weeks.
We've had some people this week predict perhaps we're seeing the end of globalization. Larry Fink, for example, from BlackRock, said that in the media. What do you think about that as a possibility at this point?
We're certainly seeing the evolution of hyperglobalization. We're going to see more emphasis on just-in-time case rather than just-in-time. But I don't think we're going to see anything like the end of globalization. I think as long as there are smartphones, as long as there are video cameras, as long as there is Zoom, we are going to see levels of interaction between countries that are greater than anything that was taking place even 20 years ago. So I think discussions of the demise of globalization are overheated, and I think they're even a little bit dangerous because they risk a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Finally, Larry, we lost a true pioneer this week in Madeline Albright, a scholar, a diplomat, the first woman Secretary of State, and I believe when she was appointed that position, it was the most senior position ever served by a woman in the United States. I know you served with her. Give us your thoughts about Madeline Albright, what she did, what her legacy is.
Madeline was a special person. She was a role model for so many women. She ascended to the highest levels of power while always maintaining the highest level of decency, humanity, collegiality, kindness to others. She showed that you could be tough and generous at the same time. It was a privilege to serve with her. I learned a great deal from her, and her practical but moral impulse about the conduct of America's foreign policy will be very much missed. And I hope it will live on in those who've learned the lessons of her spectacular career.